The international airport was alive with movement, announcements echoed through the terminals, rolling suitcases hummed across polished floors, and passengers bustled through security lines, each lost in their own world of travel plans and destinations. Among the sea of travelers, a black woman stood beside a young man, both appearing calm on the surface yet carrying a quiet tension beneath. The woman had an air of confidence, her gaze sharp and unwavering as she observed her surroundings. Every movement around her was registered, every glance from a security officer, every shift in the atmosphere. She stood tall, her stance firm, as if prepared for anything. Beside her, the young man in a gray hoodie kept his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched. He took slow, deliberate breaths, his jaw tight, his eyes flickering with unease. The security checkpoint moved forward in an orderly rhythm. Officers checked boarding passes, directed passengers through metal detectors, and randomly selected individuals for additional screening. Everything seemed routine. Just another day at the airport. The woman and the young man stepped forward in line, inching closer to the checkpoint. Then, in an instant, the air shifted. A moment of hesitation. A sudden exchange of glances between security officers. And before either of them could process what was happening, the situation took a sharp, unexpected turn, one that neither of them had anticipated, but both were ready to fight against. As they approached the security checkpoint, the woman felt a familiar tension creep into her shoulders. The airport was bustling with travelers, a blur of voices and hurried footsteps echoing through the terminal. But despite the crowd, she could feel the security officer's eyes locked onto them, specifically onto the young man beside her. The officer, tall and broad-shouldered, stood rigid in his dark navy uniform. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze carried something heavy, something sharp. The moment the young man stepped forward, the officer's posture changed, stiffening as if bracing for something. His right hand instinctively hovered near his belt, just inches from his holstered firearm. "You!" "Step aside," the officer commanded, his voice cool, controlled. The young man hesitated. His fingers twitched at his sides, and for a fleeting second, the woman saw something flicker in his eyes, confusion, then wariness. He had done nothing wrong. They both knew that. But the weight of experience told them that didn't matter. "Why?" the woman asked sharply, stepping in before the young man could move. The officer didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the young man, scanning him like a threat. "Random screening," he said. "Bullshit." The young man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He lifted his hands slowly, palms facing outward. "I don't have anything," he said, his voice controlled but tight, as if he were forcing himself to remain calm. The woman clenched her fists. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of 100 moments just like this. The officer had already made up his mind. He wasn't seeing a person, he was seeing a suspect. Behind them, murmurs rippled through the line. A few travelers stole glances in their direction before quickly looking away. Others pretended not to notice at all. Then, another officer stepped in, taller, bulkier, mirroring the first one's rigid stance. He blocked the young man's path completely. That was it. The woman's pulse roared in her ears. She planted her feet firmly on the cold tile floor, her jaw tightening. "This is not a routine check," she said, her voice low but vibrating with barely restrained fury. "You're profiling him." The first officer's grip tightened near his belt, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. "And I'm not letting you get away with it," she finished, her voice rising. The moment hung heavy in the air, charged and unrelenting. And she knew this wasn't just about today. This was about all the times before. And all the times after. But today, she was standing her ground. As the airport security officer singled out the young black man, his hoodie becoming the sole reason for suspicion, a heavy tension settled in the air. The young man, visibly uncomfortable, complied with the officer's request and raised his hands in the universal gesture of surrender, hoping to prove he wasn't carrying any weapons. Yet, beneath the calm exterior, there was a deep unease. He could feel the stares of those around him, the weight of the assumptions placed on him simply because of his appearance. Every moment dragged on, his heart racing with a mix of frustration and fear. But then, the woman, a fellow black traveler standing a few feet away, couldn't stay silent. She had watched the interaction unfold with growing discomfort, her instincts telling her that something was deeply wrong. She had seen it before, the subtle biases, the unfair targeting of black people, and she wasn't going to let this moment pass without speaking up. As the officer continued to scrutinize the young man, she stepped forward, her voice steady but firm, cutting through the tension in the air. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her eyes locked on the officer. "Why him? What is it about his hoodie that makes him suspicious?" The question hung in the air, as the officer hesitated for a brief moment, clearly unprepared for the confrontation. The woman's words were not just an inquiry, they were a challenge, a demand for accountability. She stood tall, unwavering, her presence forcing the officer to reconsider his actions. The tension grew, as onlookers began to shift uncomfortably, sensing the growing conflict. The young man, still with his hands raised, looked over at her with a mixture of relief and gratitude. Her intervention gave him a sense of validation, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this. For a fleeting moment, the oppressive weight of his situation seemed to lift, replaced by a glimmer of hope. The confrontation was escalating, but the woman refused to back down. Her stance was resolute, her words unyielding. She was not just standing up for him, she was challenging the system, the ingrained prejudices that had brought them both to this moment. And it wasn't just about this one encounter, it was about something larger, something that affected them both deeply. Just as the situation reached its boiling point, a senior airport official arrived, reviewing the security footage. After a tense few moments, it became clear that the young man was innocent, entirely unremarkable in his actions. In fact, it was a nearby white passenger who had shown suspicious behavior, but the officer had been so blinded by bias that he had completely missed it. The revelation hit like a thunderclap, and the officer, now faced with undeniable proof, was swiftly reprimanded for his unjust actions. The woman stood with her head held high, a quiet satisfaction settling over her as she glanced at the young man beside her. They had both made it through, and not just by chance. She had stood up when it mattered most, demanding justice in a world that often silenced voices like theirs. As they walked away from the tense scene, their posture was not one of defeat, but of quiet triumph. In that moment, they both knew that the fight for equality wasn't over, but they had just won a small but significant victory. As the tense standoff between the young black man and the airport security officer continued, the atmosphere grew heavy, charged with the weight of racial bias. The young man, hands raised in the universal gesture of compliance, stood still, trying to mask the anxiety churning inside him. Every fiber of his being screamed to fight back, but he knew any wrong move could escalate the situation in ways he couldn't control. He felt exposed, his hoodie, something as simple as clothing, now weaponized against him. His mind raced, and though his body was calm, his heart thudded against his chest, the panic rising like an untamed storm inside him. Nearby, the woman, a fellow black traveler, watched the unfolding scene. Her chest tightened as she saw the officer's suspicious gaze directed solely at the young man, the reasons for his actions as clear to her as the color of his skin. She had seen this before, the unjust suspicion placed on people who looked like her, and especially those who looked like him. The feeling of helplessness had become far too familiar. But today, something shifted within her. She had seen enough. She couldn't stand by and let it happen again. With a sharp intake of breath, she stepped forward, her gaze unwavering as she focused on the officer. "What exactly are you doing?" she demanded, her voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "Why are you treating him like this? What about his hoodie makes him suspicious?" Her words cut through the charged silence, and though the officer was momentarily caught off guard, he recovered quickly. The young man shifted his gaze to her, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. Her intervention wasn't just a small act of kindness, it was a lifeline, a shield against the injustice he had grown used to. The officer's response was dismissive, his tone defensive. He wasn't ready to face the challenge she presented. But the woman wouldn't back down. She had seen the way the system worked, the way it tore people apart with its subtle prejudices, and she wasn't going to let this young man become another casualty of it. Her posture was resolute, her body language demanding an answer. "This isn't right," she said, louder now, her voice rising with authority. "You can't just assume guilt because of what someone is wearing." She stood between him and the officer, a silent barrier, refusing to let him be dehumanized without a fight. Her words echoed in the stillness of the airport, drawing the attention of onlookers, some of whom seemed uncomfortable with the confrontation. The young man, still with his hands raised, couldn't quite believe what was happening. In a world where he had often felt invisible, or worse, judged unfairly, this woman's bravery felt like an awakening. For the first time in what seemed like forever, he wasn't alone. He wasn't just another black man being treated with suspicion, there was someone standing beside him, demanding that he be seen as human, not a threat. The confrontation reached its boiling point as the officer's patience began to wear thin, but just as the air grew unbearably thick with tension, a senior airport official appeared. His presence immediately altered the dynamic of the situation. The official calmly observed the scene, taking in the heated exchange between the woman and the officer. He gestured for the officer to step back, his voice firm, yet calm. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. Without waiting for the officer's reply, the senior official moved to the security footage monitor, reviewing the tapes of the incident. The young man, still standing there, anxiously watched as the images flickered on the screen. The footage showed him, completely still, complying with the officer's commands, while another passenger, white, and far more erratic in behavior, had been moving suspiciously through the terminal. The official replayed the footage a few times, his brow furrowing as he pieced together the truth. The realization hit like a shockwave: the officer had been focused on the wrong person. The young man had been nothing more than a target for suspicion, not based on any behavior, but solely because of the color of his skin and the hoodie he wore. The real threat was someone who had slipped through unnoticed. The senior official turned to the officer, his voice now cold and commanding. "You've made a mistake," he said, his words sharp. "That man is innocent. It's the other passenger you should have been questioning." The officer, stunned by the revelation, stood frozen, his face pale as the truth washed over him. His hands fumbled as he tried to justify his actions, but his words faltered in the face of undeniable evidence. The moment was a stark reversal of power. The officer had been caught in his own biases, and now the young man stood, his innocence proven, his dignity restored. The woman, who had never once taken her eyes off the officer, felt a rush of vindication. Her courage, her refusal to stand idly by, had made all the difference. She didn't just protect the young man in front of her, she had exposed the flaws of a system that too often punished people for the wrong reasons. The officer, now visibly rattled, was swiftly reprimanded by the senior official, his authority diminished in the wake of his mistake. As the two walked away, their steps lighter, a quiet sense of victory settled over them. The young man, still processing the whirlwind of events, turned to the woman beside him. Their eyes met, no words were needed. She had stood up for him in a way that he would never forget. Together, they had turned the tables, challenging the injustice they had both experienced, and in that moment, they knew that sometimes, standing up against the odds could make all the difference. As the tension finally began to lift, with the senior official delivering his reprimand and the security officer standing awkwardly in his shame, the woman and the young man, still processing the whirlwind of events, began to walk away. The brief moment of victory had settled over them like a soft breath, but their minds were still racing, heartbeats still quickened by the emotional roller coaster they had just endured. The young man, still shaken, walked beside the woman, his steps tentative, unsure if what had just happened was real. He glanced at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and a newfound respect. She had stood by him when no one else would, and now, for the first time in a long while, he felt like someone had truly seen him, not for the color of his skin, not for the hoodie he wore, but for the person he was. She had given him a voice when he was too afraid to speak up. But just as they were about to round the corner, the soft sound of footsteps following them interrupted the quiet relief. The woman, ever alert, turned slightly, her hand instinctively moving toward the small of her back, ready for whatever might come next. The young man froze, his pulse spiking once again. But when they both turned to face the source of the sound, their expressions shifted from apprehension to confusion as they saw the officer walking slowly toward them. "Wait," the officer's voice called out, his tone not as commanding as it had been earlier but hesitant, almost unsure. The woman instinctively stiffened, her posture defensive, while the young man's eyes narrowed slightly. The officer, who had once exuded a sense of authority, now appeared vulnerable, his face flushed with the uncomfortable realization of his mistake. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, a tension of its own, and for a moment, neither the woman nor the young man knew what to expect. Would he double down on his actions? Would he try to explain away his behavior? They had been through enough for one day. I just wanted to apologize," the officer finally said, his words almost stumbling over each other. His gaze shifted between the woman and the young man, and there was an undeniable sense of regret in his eyes. The apology didn't come easily to him, and for a brief second, it felt like he was reaching deep within himself to find the right thing to say. I made a mistake. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and that wasn't fair. I'm really sorry for what I did." The young man stood frozen, his mind scrambling to process the words. The apology was unexpected, so much so that it took a few moments for him to even begin to understand the depth of it. In his experience, people in positions of power rarely admitted when they were wrong, especially when it involved a mistake that was so visibly tied to race. He had been conditioned to brace himself for the worst, a dismissal, a threat, perhaps even an escalation. Yet here the officer was, offering something far more vulnerable, an apology. He could feel the woman beside him tense up, her expression unreadable, her stance protective, as if ready to shield him from any more harm, just in case this was some sort of trap. The young man didn't know how to feel. Was this apology sincere? Could it be that the officer truly understood the weight of his actions, or was it simply a way to deflect the fallout from his misstep? The question swirled in his mind. "Thank you," the woman replied, her voice steady, but her eyes were hard, unsentimental. She wasn't ready to accept the apology just yet, not without a deeper understanding of what had led to this moment. But words alone aren't enough. You've caused harm, and now you need to take responsibility for it. Apologizing is the first step, but real change requires more. It's not just about saying you're sorry, it's about making sure this doesn't happen again, not just to him, but to anyone. The officer took a breath, and for the first time, his posture seemed less rigid, more reflective. He looked at the woman, then at the young man, and nodded slowly. "I understand. And I will make sure this doesn't happen again. I'll learn from this. I've already spoken to my supervisor about making some changes in the way we do things. I'll do better, I promise." There was something in his voice now, a quiet sincerity that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just speaking out of guilt or to placate them, he seemed to truly grasp the significance of the moment. The young man looked at the officer for a long time, his mind still wary but slowly softening. He had been ready for conflict, ready for an apology that would mean little, just another hollow gesture. But this was different. The woman nodded slightly, her posture easing just a fraction. "I hope you mean it," she said softly. "And I hope you understand that it's not just one mistake. It's about changing a system, changing the way people like us are seen and treated. That's where the real work starts." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply gave them a quiet nod, his face showing that he knew she was right. There was still much to be done, but in that brief exchange, there was the possibility of change. Real change. As the officer turned and walked away, the young man and the woman stood there for a moment longer. The air felt different now, less oppressive, as if the weight of the encounter had shifted, transformed into something more tangible, something that could spark hope. They didn't say anything to each other at first, but when their eyes met, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had faced a system that tried to label them, tried to break them down with its prejudices, but they had stood their ground. And now, as they turned to leave, there was a feeling that they had made a dent in that system, that for once, the cycle had been broken. There was no grand gesture, no victory speech, but in that quiet moment, both of them knew that they had done something powerful. They walked away, side by side, their heads held high, not just as survivors of a flawed system but as people who had changed the course of that day with their courage. And for the first time, they truly believed that maybe, just maybe, their actions could ripple out and inspire a broader change, one apology, one shift in awareness at a time.